In this unit, we're going to discuss constraints. And basically, a constraint is a rule that, well, there's two ways that we use constraints. One, it's a rule that we use to enforce business rules or policies. So that's the first way we use constraints. The second way is to ensure accuracy and integrity of our data in the database itself. So basically, constraints come down to two things. It's either trying to enforce a rule that we have about the business. For example, maybe we have a rule that no one can earn more than a certain amount of money, or you can't earn less than a certain amount of money. That could be a constraint that requires certain values or ranges of values in a field. And then we also have rules that ensure the accuracy and integrity of the data, which is things like foreign keys and primary keys, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second. We'll kind of review that a little bit, what that means. But there are basically 5 constraints that I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to show you how to create primary and foreign key constraints. And then we'll talk about unique and check constraints, and then finally not null constraints, which prevent you from allowing a null value into a column. So creating a constraint is pretty straightforward. I'm going to show you the syntax here. So this is how you create a constraint. You use alter table, the name of the table. We learned a little bit about that in last week when we talked about how to manage and create tables. And then we add a constraint. So you do add constraint, and then in the name of the constraint, followed by what type of constraint it is, and then finally the name of the constraint. You'll notice that the keyword constraint with the constraint name is optional. You don't always have to provide that, but it's best practice to provide a name for your constraint so that you can locate that later on. So I'm going to show you how to do this. I'm going to show you how to create some of these constraints, and I'm going to come back to this command. But real quick, I just want to go over, before we talk about primary keys and foreign keys, let's take a look at exactly what that means. And let me just bring up a... so you probably would have created in... I'm going to give you a simple example here. Give me 1 second. All right, so in this simple example, let's say you had some data that you had to put in a database, right? We talked about this already. You actually did this in your homework in week 2. So you basically looked at a scenario of a database. Now, let's say you had a database for, I don't know, stuff that people can buy from a website or something like that. And here we have a bunch of invoices, and the invoices have all these things in it. And one of the things I asked you to do in that assignment, and something similar to this, is think about the different table names that you would have. So, in my example, I might have, 3 or 4 different tables. They would have relationships, and I would have, many to one, one to many to, many, or one to one, and so forth and so on. So we talked about already how to do these different types of relationships. But once we determine all this stuff, right, so once we have all these relationships defined, then we come up with what our tables are actually going to look like, which you did for that exercise. You brainstormed what kind of fields you would have in your tables. And one of the things you had to brainstorm was the primary keys and the foreign keys. So a primary key identifies something. So in my example here, I have a bunch of tables here, right? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 tables. Now this table up here would be the line items on an invoice. Now the line item on the invoice would be the primary key, right? So line item is the primary key, but item might be a foreign key, which would reference the item in the items table, right? So we have the invoice line items, and instead of putting the actual name of the products on the invoice line item table, instead we reference we reference that in a foreign table, right? As a foreign key. And then likewise, I might have an invoice number, which is a foreign key to the invoice table, right? So we have the line items on the invoice and then the actual invoice itself. And then, for example, we have the salesperson on the invoice, which references the salesperson table. We have the customer, which represents the customer table, right? So we have all these primary keys and foreign keys, and I just wanted to give you kind of a quick synopsis of what foreign keys are. We're going to come back to this later. I'm going to use this little slide deck later on when we talk about joins, which we have to have a good understanding of primary and foreign keys and how those relationships work in order to do joins. So we'll come back to that. But for right now, I want to show you how we create these foreign keys. So for example, in our database, in our sample database that we've been working with, and I'll just put this below here. So in our sample database, we have a customers table, and in that customers table, there is a primary key called the customer number, right? So we have the customer number. So if I wanted to create that primary key, this is the command that I would run to do that. This would alter the customers table. and I can add a constraint. Notice here I gave it a name. I called it PK customers customer number. This is best practice. I usually prefix all of my object names with what it is, with the exception of tables. I don't usually prefix those, but a lot of the other objects that we'll talk about in this course, you'll usually see me put a little prefix on it to describe what it is, so that if I'm looking at a list of objects, I know kind of what it is at a glance. This is the table that that object is created for, and this is the row that it's, or I'm sorry, the column that it's created for. So in this case, we're adding a primary key, and that primary key is going to be on the customer number. So I would run that, and then it would create that primary key, unless, of course, the table already has a primary key, which is the case here. But this is how one might have created that primary key. Now, if I created that primary key, let's take a look and test this and see if it works, right? So what should happen, let me do select star from customers, and we'll take a look at a list of customers. I'm going to change this to a big number so we can see everything. So here we have a list of customers, right? And you'll notice that our last customer in the list has an ID number of 1020, right? Who happens to be in Trenton, New Jersey. So I'm going to go back up to the top here. So let's say I wanted to insert a new record. Let me copy and paste some code here. All right, so here I'm going to insert a new customer record. And notice I'm using the same customer ID number, right? The same customer number. Since we have a primary key constraint, we should not be able to have more than one customer with the same primary key, right? So if I were to run this, I should get an error message. Hopefully we get one here. Let's see what happens. There we go. So this violates the constraint. So it tells us here that, and you can see that the textbook publisher chose to call the constraint something different than what I would call it, right? But we can see here that this is a primary key constraint because we have a little suffix on here that says PK that they've added to the name to make it a little bit more obvious. But basically, we know it's a primary key, so we can't make that change. Now, let's say we're going to go back. Let's look at find tables. So find tables is kind of nice because it lets you look at what the tables are. We should have a table for order items. So let's say if we have an order items table. There we go. So here's our order items table. And let's take a look at some of the columns here. So you have the order number, the item number, the ISBN, quantity, and how much they paid for each of those items, right? So if I wanted to make a foreign key, now in this case, normally we have a primary key. We've been talking about it being just one field, right? And here we could have just the order number as the primary key, but we could also make the primary key a combination of both the item number and the order number, right? Because the combination of both of these would be unique. And maybe we want to do that so that it kind of allows us to cluster that key. And I'm going to talk about clustered keys later on. We'll get into more detail on how to do indexes in another unit. So you don't have to remember exactly what this means right now, but know that sometimes there's going to be times when you want to make primary keys that are the combination of multiple fields, of multiple rows. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll show you the syntax to do that. Let me just paste some code in here. All right, so if I were to run this, assuming I don't already have a primary key, which I do, right? That table already has this primary key, but this is how it would create a primary key on multiple columns. So in this case, it would have a primary key that's the combination of both the order number and the item number. So what that would mean is I can have duplicate order numbers as long as I also have just one item number for that order number. And basically what that means is I don't have to have my own primary key in this table, right? I always know that any order is going to have, anything that's an order item, an order item is going to have an order number and it's going to have an item number. So why bother creating that third column when the other two make it unique and we can just use that? All right, so let's do another example here. So foreign keys. So let me show you how to create a foreign key. So let me copy and paste some code here. So this would be the code you would use to create a foreign key constraint. So a foreign key constraint basically means that this table references another table. Now what this is going to do is it's going to enforce the integrity between these two different tables. So we have two tables here. We have the orders table and we have the customers table. So what this means is that in my orders table I have a customer number. I will not be able to add an order unless that customer number exists as a customer. So if I try to add an order for a non-existing customer, it's not going to work. It's going to say the when you're trying to add that order, it's going to say that customer doesn't exist, you can't add it, right? Well, it won't use those exact words, but that's the idea here. So this not only enforces a business rule, it also enforces a database integrity. So it kind of does both for us. And that's pretty common, actually, that, a lot of times the database integrity sort of follows along with the business rules. All right, so and I'm pretty sure that this is going to fail because I'm fairly certain we already have this foreign key constraint. Yeah, so we already have the foreign key constraint in this case. So the other thing I want to tell you real quick about the, oh wait, maybe I don't have an orders table. I thought I did. Yeah, no, I do have an orders table. Let me look in my table list here. So let's go back to tables. No, it's taken a while. Let me try it again. There we go. All right, so here's the orders table. So we do have an orders table, and I'm not entirely sure if we already have that foreign key constraint, but here's our customer number. And you can see here that it cannot be null. So, or no, it can be null. So that may not actually exist as a foreign key constraint. So now, before I do this, just one more thing I wanted to show you is you can also add a cascade, delete cascade. What this does, I'm going to show you here. I'll put the syntax in here. So what the on delete cascade does, so if I have an order number, right, that has a customer, it's a valid customer number, what happens if I delete that customer? If I delete the customer and that foreign key still exists in the child table, this is the child table, obviously, then that means I now have a customer number that does not reference a real customer anymore, and that violates some integrity rules. If I leave off the on delete cascade, then it will not have any effect, right? So if I delete a customer record and they have orders, they're still going to have those orders. We just don't we won't be able to reference which customer those orders belong to. If I put the on delete cascade at the end of this statement, then when we delete a customer, it will automatically delete all of those orders as well. The thing is, that sounds like a good thing, but sometimes that's not exactly what you want. So it's good to think about the database design and the business rules to determine whether or not that's really what you want. Now, obviously, adding an order for a non-existing customer is a bad idea, but do you want to allow orders to exist without the valid customer existing anymore is a different question, right? And there are definitely cases where it makes sense to do that cascading delete, but there are also a lot of legitimate cases where it makes sense to not delete the orders. Maybe we need them for aggregation or to do analytics and things like that. Maybe we don't want to keep our customers' information for longer than we have to. Maybe they have a 30-day return policy, after which time we don't care about the customer anymore, but we still need to keep a record of those sales for another year or two so that we can use it for analytics or so we can, look up information later on, whatever. So it's a good idea to think about how you're going to use that. So if I were to run this, it would create that constraint. It would add that constraint, and it would allow it to delete on cascade. However, it's not working because I believe I already have a foreign key constraint on this table, so it's not going to let me run this. But we'll take a look at that later on. But I would have to run this on a new table, obviously, for it to work, or delete my existing foreign key constraint. I'll show you how to delete them here in a few minutes. So another type of constraint is the unique constraint. So now I should tell you that a primary key constraint is implicitly unique, right? Because you can't have more than one primary key, but sometimes there are other fields that we want to keep unique. In this example, we might have a unique a unique key constraint on the title field, right? So here we're going to alter the books table, and we are going to add a constraint that makes sure that the title is unique. So you can never have two books that have the same title. Now, in reality, I think that could happen, right? So this may not be the best business rule. This is something that you would have to think about if you were designing this database for a book company or something like that, or a library or what have you. But in any event, if I run this, it's going to make sure that I can only have a book title one time, regardless of all of the other fields. So let me go ahead and run this. I'm pretty sure I don't have this constraint already. So here it went ahead and added that constraint. So now if I try to insert another book that has the same title, it's going to fail, right? It's going to say that title already exists. You can't insert that. You have to come up with another title. Good example for this would be maybe the table for usernames, right? If you have a table for usernames in a web application, you might have a unique constraint so that you can only have one username. That may not be the primary key. Maybe you have something else that you use for the primary key, but you still want to make sure that you can have more than one username. So you can use a unique key constraint for that. So that's how, I'm sorry, just a unique constraint, not a key. So another type of constraint, so we have the unique, which makes sure that everything is unique. Another one is the check constraint. So the check constraint allows you to check for the value to be in some range or a value to be of some attribute. So here we're going to alter the orders table and put in a constraint that the ship date has to be less than or equal to, I'm sorry, the order date has to be less than or equal than the ship date. So this is going to make sure that that the date that they put in for shipping is not before the order date, right? That would not make sense that somebody would put in a ship date that's before the date they actually ordered it, right? What if a customer did that and then they could complain they didn't get it on time because they put the the date in the past to try to push that date forward. So that would be an example. But and again, this is another example of a business rule that we're enforcing through constraints. So lots of different ways that you can try to check the range or check the type of data that you're inserting. But I don't know if this will let me run it. I think I already have this constraint, but let's see if it works. Oh, it added it. There we go. So we just added a constraint to the orders table that that checks to see to make sure that that ship date is in range. All right. So what else can we do? So we have the check constraint. Oh, and null constraints. That's the last one. So I talked about there are 5 constraints we're talking about. There's primary key, foreign key, which we talked about. Then the unique and the check constraints, which are mostly for business rules, right? So primary and foreign key are very much about database integrity, but although they can enforce business rules, the check and unique are more typically used for business rules or enforcing business rules in the database. And then finally, we have not null. And I think I've mentioned this before that that null values in your database can ruin your day. For one thing, I talked about the unique constraint. Just as one example, that unique constraint would not have any effect on null columns. So if you have a value that's null and you try to insert another row with a null value, it will allow you to do that, even though they're both seem like they're the same, right? But remember, nulls is the absence of any value at all. So it's not like you have two rows with the same value. You have 2 rows that have nothing in for that particular column. So it doesn't really check that constraint. So one of the tools we have as a DBA is to not allow the use of null values in certain columns so that we can prevent issues like that. And I think I talked about some of the other issues with null values before in the prior units. So I think I probably talked about when you're doing arithmetic operations, for example, if you have a null value, you end up with a null. It doesn't just add up the things that are not null. If there's anything in that set that's null, it makes everything null. Essentially, it makes your result null even though it's not. So sometimes you get erroneous values like that. So it's a good idea sometimes. And again, it's one of those things that you would think about as a DBA. What columns is it appropriate, or a database designer, which columns is it appropriate to not allow null? And this is the syntax. You'll notice this is a little bit different than the previous syntax. Before we added a constraint. So we did alter table, table name, and then we typed add, and then the constraint, then constraint name. But here we're doing modify. So remember, with when you're doing a null constraint, you have to use the modify keyword. So null is a little bit different than all of the other constraints. And again, one of the main ways that it's different is because we're using modify. You'll also notice that when you do a not null constraint, if you describe a table, all of the other constraints you may not see when you describe a table. It's not going to show you check constraints and unique constraints and so forth. But when you do describe on a table, as we learned last week when we talked about table creation and management, you will see a not null constraint. It will tell you that you can't have a null in that column when you do the describe command, as we discussed before. So let me go ahead and run this, and I think this may already exist as a constraint, but let's see if it works. And it worked, so we didn't already have that as a constraint. So now we have a constraint, and I prefixed mine with NN for not null. So this basically, I just called my constraint not null orders customer number. Okay, so the other thing we can do, I've been showing you how to add constraints when you already have a table, right? So we already have a table. We decided that we're going to make something a primary key. We decided we're going to make something else a foreign key. But that's not typical, right? Typically, we don't create tables and then decide to make something a foreign key. If you're doing database design the right way, you've already established all of that stuff. You've already figured out what your constraints are going to be, that you're going to check certain values, you're going to enforce unique constraint on other values. All of that's already been established. So rather than going back and creating all this stuff, instead we could just do it when we create the table in the first place. So let's say I was creating a table called department, right? So let's say I have a department table. My department has a department number, right? So each department's going to have a unique department number. That's going to be the primary key. So when I create that table, right after I declare the column name and the data type, I'm then going to also add the constraint after that. So the syntax looks very similar as add. So pretty much everything after, alter table, add constraint, et cetera, is pretty much the same. You just add that to the end of each column name. And here's another example. So here we have the department name, which is not null, right? So we added not null on here, which we don't have to use the modify command because we're just creating it from scratch, right? We learned about how to do this before. But again, I just add my constraint to the end. So here I'm adding the unique constraint. And of course, it's a good idea to make this not null. Otherwise, if somebody forgets to put a department name in a few times, we're going to have a bunch of departments with no name, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? So, it's a good idea if you're going to do a unique constraint, you probably also want to make it not null. And then here's just the typical column that has none of the options, right? Just to show you the syntax. So let's go ahead and run this, and it should create our table for us. And let's see what happens, unless I got the syntax wrong here somewhere. So it looks like it worked. So it created that table. Now, one thing I wanted to show you real quick is when we create tables, if you're, this might come in handy when you're doing the assignments. If you go into, where are we here? You're going to go into the object browser. Sorry, my internet's a little bit slow here. So I should see that department table now in the object browser, and if I click on it, it's going to show me the columns, right? I think you've been using this already probably to go and look at your tables. But if you go all the way to the end up here, if you click on SQL, this is going to show you the SQL commands that you would use to create that table. There we go. Sorry, it took a while to load. But there it is. So this is how I could just take this, and if you wanted to, you could take this code and copy and paste it into your project, and you would be able to create the same table. So you wouldn't have to type all this out by hand. So, and of course, it looks a little bit different here, right? Because this is automatically generated by Oracle. When you click that SQL button, it looks at the schema and it creates this dynamically. It's not creating it from the command that I originally ran to create that table. Now, just to give you another example, let me go back to the SQL command line here. I'll show you a little bit more complicated table. So we'll do the order items table here. So I've already done that that SQL on the ran that command to look at the SQL. So this is the SQL that you would use to generate the order items table that you already have. So if you've already created this database from the files, the textbook files, then you would be able to see this code, and this is roughly what it looks like. And of course, some of this is a little bit different than what we've talked about. For example, we have the double quotes around some of the field names, which is fine. That's just proper syntax. But you can see here the constraints are added. They're just concatenated right to the bottom, right? So, so for example, the item number and order number are the primary key, but it's a composite primary key. You can't do that in line when you're creating a table. You can't indicate that both of those are a primary key. Otherwise, it tries to create both of them as an independent primary key, which wouldn't work. So instead, at the bottom, you'll see the command where it's actually the second one here, where we have constraint order items primary key, and then the primary key is the combination of both of these. And again, we just concatenate that right to the bottom of the command to create our table. And then down here we have our foreign key constraint for the ISBN number, and here we have the foreign key constraint for our order number. And again, and you have the references down here, so you can tell which table it references, which is required, by the way, for a foreign key. You can't have a foreign key without referencing another table. Now, once you have all your foreign keys, right? Once you have all of your constraints like foreign keys, primary keys, and check, constraints and so forth, you may want to take a look at that stuff, right? Now, you could do it with the Object Explorer. I showed you earlier, but it's a little bit difficult. As I said, the only constraints that really show up in the Object Explorer are going to be your primary keys, to some extent your foreign keys. It'll say that it references another table, and the and not null, of course. If you have that constraint, that'll also show up in the schema when you're looking through the Object Explorer. If you run this command, it should give you the a list of the constraints for a table. Of course, I don't have this table equip, which I got from the textbook. So let me just do orders. All right, let's see if this table, there we go. That looks a little better, right? So here are my constraints for the orders table, right? So there's the ship date constraint, which we talked about. Here is the customer number, can't be null. Here we have the order date cannot be null. And of course, this one was not named by the DBA. It looks like it got a name automatically when it was created. So that's why it looks a little bit more cryptic. And then we have a couple other constraints down here. This is the primary key constraint, and this is the foreign key constraint, right? So P is the foreign key, and R is the I'm sorry, P is the primary key, and R is the foreign key constraint. And then these are just regular constraints up here. These are check constraints, really, I should say. All right, so that's how we look at that. So let's take another look at another example here. And I'm going to have to change the table name on this one as well. But so, and I'm just going to add here. Well, I don't really need to add that. So let me change this to orders. Obviously, it won't find anything because I don't. But it's just another way that we can look at these constraints. You can see here no data was found. All right, so that's another command we can use to look at constraints. And then we have some alter commands. So if you wanted to disable a constraint, if for some reason you don't want to use that constraint, and I've had to do this before if I'm trying to insert records, sometimes you have to go in disable the constraint for a period of time for some reason. This is the command that you would do that. So you can run the alter table name just like before, and then you would disable a constraint. And then later on, if you wanted to use that constraint again, so if you're ready to turn that constraint back on, you would just go in and run the command to enable the constraint. So you can both disable or enable a constraint for a period of time. Of course, if you just don't want to use the constraint at all anymore, you could drop it, right? So it's kind of like dropping a table. It's but instead of a table, we're just dropping the constraint. So this is the command to drop a constraint. So for example, as a real-world example, and this is from your textbook, if I had the equipment table, which I don't, I didn't create it, but if I did and I wanted to drop the check constraint, then this would be the command to do so. So I would just drop constraint and then the constraint name, and that would drop that constraint. You could also drop a primary key, you can drop a unique constraint, or any other type of constraint. So for example, if I wanted to get rid of my primary key on the customers table, this is what it would look like. So this would drop the primary key constraint on my customers table, which you ordinarily wouldn't want to delete a primary key, right? I suppose you could if you're creating a new primary key. So sometimes with databases, we might realize that our selection of a primary key was flawed after we've got a live system for a while, and we may need to create a new column for a new primary key. You know, I'll give you a good example. Let's say I decided to use the social security number as the primary key in some database. You know, I think most of us assume that social security numbers are unique, and then you try to add somebody new to the database, and it turns out they have the same social security number as someone else. And oddly enough, that's completely legitimate. It happens. The way the Social Security Administration used to hand out social security numbers, it was possible that you would have duplicates, although it wasn't common. That's one of those things we can't tell somebody, I'm sorry, you can't be a customer because somebody already has your social security number. So that might be a case where we'd go back and create a new column name. We might use an auto increment for the column name, so create our own serialized ID. I'll talk about how to do that later on. We'll talk about how to create increments, you know, to auto generate those sequences, and then we would go back and remove the old primary key and make the new value a primary key, the new column. All right, so that's basically everything you need to know about constraints. So let me just do a quick summary here. So we talked about the constraint being a rule that can either enforce a business rule or a policy. or it can be used for data integrity in our database, right? So we can ensure data integrity. I talked about how you can create these constraints either when you are creating your table or later on you can use the alter table command. I talked about primary key constraints. I also talked about foreign key constraints and how to reference other tables with a foreign key constraint, and also a little bit about uh, doing cascading deletes so that we can decide whether or not our children records will be deleted when the parents are deleted. I talked about the unique key constraint, which ensures that no two columns can have the same value, or no more than one column can have the same value. I also talked about the check constraint, which can meet a specific condition of some kind. Our example was where the order date is greater than or equal to the ship date. I talked about the not null constraint, which is a special type of constraint which prevents you from using null values in a column. We talked about how to enable and disable the constraints should you need to do that, and if you don't want to use the constraint at all anymore, you can use the drop command, and then I showed you how to select constraints from the database if you're trying to determine what they are without using the Object Explorer, because again, the Object Explorer doesn't always show you what those constraints are. It shows you, by default, you should see your foreign key, primary key, and not null constraints, but the check constraints and E constraints won't always be displayed in Object Explorer in all these user interfaces, although some do. So that's it. So that's what you need to take away from this unit. And there's some practice exercises. And if you have any questions, let me know.